You walk into a room full of people you've never met and one face stops you, not because they're striking, not because they're doing anything unusual. Something about them just feels familiar, like you've met before, even though you haven't. You'll probably brush it off. A passing thought, a trick of memory. It isn't a trick. It's a pattern, and your brain has been running it your entire life. Start with the strangers you pass and never speak to. The same barista every morning. The same person on your platform standing in roughly the same spot, waiting for the same train. You never learn their name. You never say a word to them. And yet somehow, seeing them missing from their usual spot one day gives you a tiny flicker of unease, as if something in your world is slightly out of place. In 1972, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram, the same researcher famous for his controversial obedience experiments, turned his attention to something much quieter. He noticed that city dwellers built up an entire mental roster of people they recognized but never interacted with. He gave this phenomenon a name: the familiar stranger. Milgram's team photographed commuters at a train station, then showed those same photos back to the commuters later, asking who they recognized. Most people could identify several familiar strangers, faces tied to no name, no conversation, no real relationship at all, and yet clearly logged and stored somewhere in memory. Here's what made Milgram's findings strange. These familiar strangers weren't neutral. People reported real emotional reactions to them, a flicker of comfort seeing them, a small jolt of unease if the routine broke. Some participants said they'd feel genuinely thrown off if a familiar stranger suddenly showed up somewhere unexpected, like spotting your usual bus stop face at a party across town. Your brain doesn't just catalog faces. It builds a quiet emotional relationship with them, without asking your permission first. Milgram noted something else worth sitting with. Despite these quiet emotional bonds, almost nobody ever crossed the line into actually speaking to their familiar strangers. There seemed to be an unwritten social rule keeping the relationship exactly where it was, close enough to register, far enough to stay silent. Decades later, researchers revisiting the concept found the same pattern holding up in modern cities, on modern trains, among people glued to modern phones. The specific technology changes. The quiet architecture of unspoken recognition doesn't. Why would your mind bother forming a bond with someone it has literally never spoken to? The answer traces back to something far more basic than social connection. It traces back to exposure itself. In the late 1960s, a psychologist named Robert Zajonc ran a series of experiments that would end up reshaping how scientists understood liking and preference. Zajonc showed participants a set of unfamiliar images, Turkish-sounding words, Chinese characters, simple shapes, nonsense stimuli with no inherent meaning. Some images were shown once. Others were shown multiple times, over and over, without explanation, without context, without anyone telling participants what the images meant. Afterward, Zajonc asked a simple question: which images do you like more? The results were almost eerie in their consistency. People preferred the images they'd seen more often, not because those images were prettier or more meaningful or more interesting, just because they'd seen them before. Zajonc called this the mere exposure effect, and it turned out to be one of the most reliable findings in all of social psychology. Familiarity itself, with zero added information, was enough to generate warmth. What made this finding land so hard in psychology was how little it seemed to depend on conscious awareness at all. In later versions of the experiment, researchers flashed images so briefly that participants couldn't even consciously report having seen them, just a few milliseconds, well below the threshold of deliberate recognition. Preferences still shifted toward the repeated images anyway. The liking didn't require noticing. It didn't require memory in any way you could describe out loud. Somewhere below the level of conscious thought, exposure alone was quietly tallying up, and that tally was steering feeling, whether or not the rest of you was paying attention. Think about what that implies about the stranger who felt familiar to you. Your brain may not need a reason to like a face. It may simply be running a background tally of every face it's crossed paths with, and quietly nudging your emotions toward anyone who shows up on that tally more than once, even if you can't consciously place where you've seen them. There's a survival logic buried underneath this. For most of human history, an unfamiliar face in your environment could mean danger, an outsider, a threat. A familiar face, on the other hand, was ably part of your group, someone who hadn't hurt you yet, someone whose patterns you already understood, even in small ways. Repeated exposure without a single negative encounter was itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that this person was safe enough to not have hurt you the first 10 times you saw them. Your brain, running on ancient rules, still treats mere repetition as a small, quiet vote of trust. But exposure alone doesn't explain everything. Some strangers feel more than familiar. They feel oddly, specifically warm, like you're seeing a slightly blurred photograph of someone you already know. That sensation has its own research trail, and it points somewhere more personal than a train platform. A researcher named Lisa DeBruine ran a series of studies looking at how facial resemblance shapes trust, using a clever trick: digitally morphing a stranger's face with the participant's own face, blending the two at different strengths, then asking people to rate how trustworthy, warm, or likable that morphed stranger appeared. Participants had no idea their own features had been quietly folded into the image. The results were consistent and a little unsettling. The more a stranger's face resembled the participant's own, the more trustworthy and likable that stranger seemed, even though the participant couldn't explain why. Nobody looked at these blended faces and thought, "That's part me." They just felt an unexplained pull toward it. De Bruyn's work suggested self-resemblance acts as a kind of hidden kinship signal. Somewhere deep in your visual processing, a face that shares structural features with your own, or with people who raised you, or with people you've simply spent the most time around, gets quietly flagged as safe, familiar, almost family. Follow-up work extended the effect in a direction that made the underlying logic even clearer. Researchers found the boost to trust worked even in scenarios involving cooperation and fairness. Participants were more willing to trust a self-resembling stranger with money in simple economic trust games, splitting small sums with someone they just met based purely on facial resemblance. No conversation, no track record, just enough shared bone structure to tip the scale toward trust. The effect was small, subtle, easy to miss in daily life. But it showed up again and again, across different labs, different countries, different sets of faces, which is exactly the kind of quiet consistency that tells researchers a real mechanism is at work, not a fluke. This is where things start to click into place. The people who raised you had a face. The people who surrounded you as a child, siblings, cousins, neighbors, had faces too, faces you saw thousands of times before you ever developed a conscious memory to store them properly. Those early faces didn't disappear. They became a kind of template, a rough statistical average your brain built quietly in the background of what a safe face generally looks like. You never chose this template. You didn't consent to it. It assembled itself out of pure repetition, the same mechanism Zajonc found lurking behind mere exposure, just applied to the most important images a developing brain ever processes: the people around you. So when a stranger walks into a room and something about their bone structure, their eye shape, the way their eyebrows sit, happens to land close to that early template, your brain doesn't experience it as a resemblance calculation. It experiences it as familiarity, as warmth, as "I feel like I know you, even though you've never met." None of this requires the stranger to actually resemble anyone specific in your life. It can be a blend, an echo, a rough statistical average pulled from hundreds of forgotten faces layered on top of each other. You're not recognizing a person. You're recognizing a pattern built from thousands of people, compressed down into a feeling. It's worth sitting with how much this complicates the idea of instant connection. That flicker you feel meeting someone new, the sense that you just click, might have very little to do with who they actually are. It might be your nervous system quietly matching bone structure and microexpressions against a private archive you built before you could even talk. Two total strangers can walk into the same room, and one will feel like an old friend within 30 seconds, while the other, equally kind, equally interesting, simply doesn't land the same way. The difference isn't necessarily anything either person did. It's a resemblance calculation running silently underneath the conversation, shaping how open and warm you feel before either of you says much of anything. This cuts in both directions and not always kindly. If your brain leans toward trusting familiar-looking faces, it also, by definition, treats faces further from your early template with a little more caution, a little more distance, entirely without your permission. This is part of how ordinary in-group bias quietly forms. Not from conscious prejudice, but from a completely unconscious pattern-matching system built in early childhood and never updated with any deliberate thought. Understanding where the feeling comes from doesn't make you immune to it, but it does mean you can catch it. You can notice that instant sense of "I trust this person" and ask whether it's actually earned, or whether it's just an old, quiet familiarity echo doing the talking. So the next time a stranger's face stops you without any clear reason, consider what's actually happening. You are not imagining a past life or a cosmic coincidence or fate. You're running one of the oldest, quietest algorithms your brain owns, cross-referencing a new face against a private, invisible archive built from every face you've ever half noticed, going all the way back to before you could speak. The barista, the bus stop stranger, the people who raised you. All of it compressed into a single flicker of warmth or wariness, delivered to you as pure feeling, with the actual math hidden completely out of view. You walk into a room full of people you've never met and one face stops you. Now you know why. It isn't magic. It's memory wearing a stranger's face.